So, let us then begin our discussion on postmodernism and consumer society. So, as the title of this essay suggests, uh, this essay tries to define postmodernism and somewhere also tries to uh, link it with consumer society. So, our job is first of all to understand what is postmodernism, and secondly, what is the relationship of postmodernism with consumer society, with consumer culture, okay, with the market, with the new consumption patterns. Okay, are they two related in any way, or it is not very appropriate to say that postmodernism and consumerism or consumer society have a direct or indirect relationship, but it is Fredric Jameson's thesis that postmodernism and consumer society are inextricably and very closely linked. They are integral to one another. So, in what ways does he define postmodernism, and in what ways he establishes the relationship between postmodernism, consumer society? This is uh, it's our job to understand this. So, as I have already told you, this essay follows a very systematic plan and a structure. In the first part, there are 5 or 6 parts in which this essay can be divided in order to form an understanding of this essay. Okay, so the first part tries to define postmodernism. I should say it is an admission. In the first part, there is an admission that there is no clear cut or there is no a clear way of understanding postmodernism. It is an admission that it is very difficult to define postmodernism because it is a complex phenomena. There are several aspects which need to be reconciled and understood if we want to understand postmodernism. So, in the first part, as I said, the writer tries to define it ironically by saying that it is very difficult to understand postmodernism and it is a term which is incompletely and inaccurately understood. One. In the second part, he describes postmodernism as a reaction against high modernism. Okay, high modernism was a uh, was a very uh, you know important uh, genre. It was a very important tendency, okay, in art, okay, which preceded postmodernism. So there is a temporal, okay, there is a temporal contiguity or continuity between the two, because as I said, high modernism preceded postmodernism immediately. So there is a temporal contiguity between the two. So this is the second part. In the third part, he uh, looks at postmodernism as something which is a result of two things. One, the effacement of high culture, the effacement of the distinction between high culture and low culture. One. Two, it is a result of the collapse of conventional academic disciplines and the emergence of theory, something called theory. In the next two parts, the writer focuses on two terms, pastiche and schizophrenia, because according to him, pastiche and schizophrenia are two very important ways of understanding postmodernism, because postmodernism is characterized by one, pastiche, and two, schizophrenia. Okay, the various developments that take place as part of postmodernism, the various attributes which are integral to postmodernism, the various changes, the various innovations taking place in postmodernism can all be described as one, pastiche, and second, schizophrenia. So this is how the essay is structured. Now let us begin with the first part. In the first part, he begins by saying that the concept of postmodernism is not widely accepted or even understood today. Okay? Some people resist the term and do not agree that such a phenomena has actually witnessed an emergence. So there is both resistance, skepticism, lack of understanding, okay, uh, incomplete understanding of this term. And then in the first part itself, okay, he says that one thing is surely there, that postmodernism is characterized by a lot of experimentation. Lot of experimentation. This experimentation is obviously different from the experimentation that took place as part of high modernism. We will be taking examples both of modernism and of high modernism, okay? Because he sees modernism, okay, both as an extension, he sees postmodernism both as an extension of modernism and as a revolt against it. Okay? In some ways, it is an extension of modernism. In some ways, it is a revolt against, it is a reaction against high modernism. So the very term postmodernism, the post part of postmodernism, obviously suggests that this cultural experience, this cultural phenomena takes us in different directions from modernism. In some ways, it extends the boundaries of modernism. In other ways, it counters modernism and it is a revolt against modernism. So, both modernism and basically the term modern means new. Okay? If we look at the basic meaning of the term modern means new. So postmodern would be in that sense, okay, a new conception of newness, a new conception of newness, because we experienced the human societies all over the world experienced modernism for maybe more than 100 years, and then this term postmodernism, okay, uh, is a is an evidence that the phase of modernism has undergone drastic changes, requiring a new term, postmodernism. So, Jameson in this 1988 essay tries to, uh, define this term, tries to comes to terms with it, tries to theorize it, tries to conceptualize it, tries to give a framework, and as I said, links it with two things. One is pastiche and the other is schizophrenia. So after saying that it is a phenomena which is very inaccurately and very incompletely understood, he gives us the names of a few writers, musicians, intellectuals, filmmakers who he considers to be postmodern figures or people who practice postmodernism. Okay? So are among them are Andy Warhol, Philip Glass, then Robert Venturi, Ishmael Reed, and so many more. The literature and art, music and architecture produced by these writers, these figures, these people, is, according to Jameson, an example of postmodernism. So they are all popular. John Cage, okay, Philip Glass, they are all very popular figures. And you can read about them, because we do not have time or space to take up each one of them and discuss their works. So you can look up the internet and see what kind of art, what kind of literature, what kind of music, what kind of architecture was produced by these people. Then we come to the second part. This list, I am reading from the second paragraph in this essay. This list would seem to make two things clear at once. First, most of the postmodernisms mentioned above emerge as a specific reaction against the established forms of high modernism. One. Okay. One. The first, ਜਿੱਥੋਂ ਉਹ postmodernism ਨੂੰ define ਕਰਨਾ start ਕਰ ਰਿਹਾ. He says that the list of the exponents of postmodernism can be extended endlessly. Can be extended. Please, you people either call her or tell her to mute herself. Okay. This list would seem to make two things clear at once. First, most of the postmodernisms mentioned above emerge as a specific reaction against the established forms of high modernism. So this is the first point, first important point. Okay, the first way in which we can understand postmodernism. I am repeating. The first way which we can understand postmodernism is that, according to Jameson, it is a reaction against high modernism, established forms of high modernism, which, as I have already said, that the age of high modernism, during which such writers as some of whom you have read, particularly T.S. Eliot, Marcel Proust, James Joyce, we can also include Virginia Woolf. Okay. The period during which these writers were producing their works is known as the age of high modernism. High modernism. Now, what do we mean by high modernism? High modernist art, of which, as I have said, the works of James Joyce, Marcel Proust, Thomas Mann, Stravinsky, and Wallace Stevens, okay, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, they are all examples of high modernism. It was an age when, again, literature was characterized by a lot of experimentation. Not only literature, music and architecture, and films as well. But simultaneously, there was one clearly defined tendency in high modernist art, and that was of abstraction. High modernist art, more or less, is art for art's sake, where art seems to abjure or to, for some time, give up the responsibility of representing society by using realism in art or by using realist methods. So art in this period you have all read T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, and you know how unconventional T.S. Eliot's Wasteland is. Some people even objected to describing Wasteland as a poem because it was prosaic. It was prosaic. It was like prose. It didn't have all that ornamentation, all that aesthetic beauty, all that romanticism, which was part and parcel of the literature before, high modernism. So, coming back to what I was saying, that high modernist art was very experimental, innovative. Stream of consciousness is a very good example of high modernist art. There is experimentation at the level of technique and subject matter both. Abstract expressionism. So it is, as I was saying, it doesn't use conventional methods such as realism in art. It seems to abjure its responsibility of representing society by using realist methods. It is very, very innovative, experimental in nature. New techniques like stream of consciousness become common. Okay? It is, as I was saying, very abstract. By all this, I mean that it seemed to adhere to the assumption that art is for art's sake, and most importantly, we witness a withdrawal. Art seems to withdraw into its own world, okay, by somehow or in various ways, okay, disrupting its relationship with society. So in the second part, Jameson is saying that postmodernism is a reaction against high modernism. Okay? It is a reaction against high. Now, it is very intriguing for us when we try to figure out that if modernism तो पहले ही एक्सपेरिमेंटल है, उसमें बहुत इनोवेशन है, तो पोस्ट मॉडर्निज्म में ऐसा क्या हो गया जो उससे भी आगे चला गया? दिस इज अ बेसिक क्वेश्चन. बिकॉज यहां पे वो एक लाइन लिख रहा है कि इट वॉज हाई मॉडर्निज्म वॉज फेल्ट टू बी स्कैंडलस, शॉकिंग बाय अवर ग्रैंड पेरेंट्स. हमारे ग्रैंड पेरेंट्स जब हाई मॉडर्निज्म पढ़ते थे उनको वो शॉकिंग लगता था, उनको वो स्कैंडलस लगता था. अब जो पोस्ट मॉडर्निज्म है, इट इज अ रिएक्शन अगेंस्ट हाई मॉडर्निज्म. सो इन सम टर्म्स इट गोज beyond the experimentation of high modernism. The second feature, I come to the next part of the essay straight away. The second feature I am reading, third paragraph. The second feature of this list of postmodernisms is the effacement in it of some key boundaries or separation, most notably the erosion of the older distinction between high culture and mass culture. और उसके बाद, in the next paragraph, he says that a rather different indication of this effacement of the older categories of genre and discourse can be found in what is sometimes called contemporary theory. So two things. One, the effacement of the distinction between high culture and it is a reaction against high modernism. चलो समझ आ गई बात. अब इसके बाद वो दो चीजें और कहते हैं. He says two more things. One, that it is an effacement. Postmodernism involves an effacement of the distinction between high culture and low culture. How do we understand this? This is very, very important. How do we understand this? What does he mean by effacement? तो इसका मतलब कि in simple terms, that art ceases to be elitist. Art ceases to be elitist. Before this, art is considered to be a domain where, whether we talk about producing art or we talk about consuming art, both of them both of them are specialized areas. So this comes to an end. We can say that massification of art takes place. So the distinction between high culture and low culture is demolished. The distinction between art and non-art is demolished. And इसके नतीजे से दो बातें होती हैं. One, the monopoly of few people or recognized figures who, we can say through common consensus, were considered to be considered to have a right to produce and read literature. That monopoly is broken. और अब क्या हो गया कि anything can lay a claim to be a piece of art. This is what he means when he says the effacement of the distinction between high culture and low culture. Okay, पहले जो सिस्टम था, जो दीवार थी कि these are examples of high culture, these are examples of low culture, that wall has been brought down. Today everything has a right. So इस लेवल पे हम कहेंगे there is an opening up of the space of art and culture. Monopolies are broken. The elitist conception of art comes to an end. I am not saying whether this is good or bad. We still are at the first, in the first part of this, we are still reading the first part of it. So at this stage, I don't think it will be right to say whether these developments are good developments or these developments are bad developments. But this is how postmodernism is understood in this essay. दूसरी चीज, so before I come to the next point, that now everything, whether it is advertisements, whether it is grade B movies, whether it is pulp fiction, whether it is popular literature, whether it is murder mysteries, whether it is love stories, cheap love stories sold at railway stations, they all have a claim to be described as art. This is the first important point in the definition of postmodernism given by Jameson. Coming to second point, the emergence of theory. The emergence of theory. Now, this is how he writes it. A rather different indication of this effacement of the older categories of genre and discourse can be found in what is sometimes called contemporary theory. Now, what is this theory? He says, the second attribute of postmodernism is the emergence of theory. कि अभी theory आ गई. What is theory? He says, theory, the emergence of theory, okay, is an outcome of the collapse of conventional academic disciplines. So, the emergence of theory, let me repeat myself, is a result of the collapse of rigorous academic and philosophical disciplines and the boundaries separating them. So, अब इसका क्या मतलब है? इसका मतलब है theory is the new philosophy now. Okay? इट इज़ अगेन, जैसे कि हमने पिछले पॉइंट में देखा था कि नाउ everything has a right to be described as literature, art. The difference between high art and low art comes to an end. There is openness now, greater openness. So the wall separating high culture and low culture, ये सारी डेवलपमेंट्स हम देख चुके हैं अब. जो सबसे इंटरेस्टिंग बात ये है, वी हैव ऑल नाउ एक्सपीरियंस्ड दिस massification of art, the claim of those works which were dumped as low art to the status of art. In many ways, we have already experienced this. Now, the next is the emergence of theory. So, he says that, yes, political science, sociology, literary criticism, the distinctions between these disciplines today have been, uh, made very, very, very dilute. They have been diluted by a new phenomena called theory. And theory has the freedom to make forays into and borrow from all these disciplines. Let me read part of this. A generation ago, there was still a technical discourse of professional philosophy, alongside which one could still distinguish that quite different discourse of the other academic disciplines like political science, sociology, literary criticism. Okay. So, when we spoke of philosophy, there were certain associations attached with the term, that philosophy was a discipline which had lot of rigor, which had a lot of intellectual rigor, depth, meaning. It came across as a tradition. And at the second level, we had academic disciplines, clearly demarcated lines that separated academic disciplines such as sociology, literary criticism, political science, history, and many more. Now, a new discipline has come into existence, and this is called theory. Theory is each one of these and all of them at the same time. Because, as I said, theory is a very loosely defined field. This new kind of discourse, generally associated with France and so-called French theory, is becoming widespread. Okay. Is the work of Michel Foucault, for example, to be called philosophy, history, social theory? So you just cannot decide whether a theorist or a writer of theory is dealing with history, is dealing with philosophy, is dealing with social theory, is dealing with political science, because he has a right to make forays into all of them and to borrow from all of them. So this is the second term which he uses to define postmodernism. So let me recapitulate. First, he defines postmodernism as as an inaccurately understood term. He names a few postmodernist composers, writers, architects, and many more, novelists. Then he talks about two things. One, कि जो पहले हाई कल्चर और लो कल्चर की डिस्टिंक्शन थी, it has been effaced, it has eroded, it has come to an end. दूसरा, वो कहता है एक नया डिसिप्लिन आ गया, तो एकेडमिक्स में भी जैसे आर्ट में और कल्चर में वो कहता है एक ओपननेस आई है, वैसे ही इसको ओपननेस कह लो या शैलोनेस कह लो, वही ओपननेस एंड शैलोनेस आपको एकेडमिक्स में भी देखने को मिल रही है. क्योंकि a new you know a new area called theory has now come into existence. And theory is not is neither political science, not history, nor sociology, nor literary criticism in a strictly speaking sense. It is all of them at one and the same time. It can borrow from all of them. So this is the second point. Then we come to the next. Now after this, yes, after this, before he comes to the very important ideas of pastiche and schizophrenia, there is a small section in which he provides a very important insight. And what is that insight? It is that we cannot understand postmodernism as a self-contained, autonomous, cultural फिनोमेना और टर्म. इसका मतलब है कि पोस्ट मॉडर्निज्म को अपने आप में नहीं समझा जा सकता टिल वी लिंक इट विद सोशल लाइफ एंड इकोनॉमिक ऑर्डर. दिस इज द थर्ड पॉइंट. पोस्ट मॉडर्निज्म इज नॉट समथिंग दैट इज सेल्फ कंटेन्ड, autonomous, affecting our cultural life only, something that is taking place or happening in culture on its own without any logic outside culture. ऐसा नहीं है. He says there is this is my third point or fourth point, that there is a relationship between the formal features of culture under postmodernism. पोस्टमॉडर्निज्म के जो भी फॉर्मल फीचर्स हैं, जो भी हो रहा है, चाहे थियरी की इमर्जेंस है, चाहे हाई कल्चर और लो कल्चर, चाहे उसके बाद पैस्टिश और पैरडी हैं, ये सब इट इज़ अ रिजल्ट ऑफ सर्टन चेंजेस दैट आर टेकिंग प्लेस इन आवर सोशल लाइफ एंड इन आवर इकोनॉमिक ऑर्डर. इकोनॉमिक ऑर्डर और सोशल लाइफ में जो कुछ चेंजेस हो रही हैं, ये उसका नतीजा है. तो लेट मी रीड अ पार्ट ऑफ दिस सेक्शन. सो ही सेज दैट द इमर्जेंस ऑफ न्यू फॉर्मल फीचर्स इन कल्चर, द इमर्जेंस ऑफ न्यू टाइप ऑफ सोशल लाइफ एंड अ न्यू इकोनॉमिक ऑर्डर, okay, they are linked. Emergence of the formal features of culture is linked with a new social life, new economic order. नया सामाजिक जीवन में बदलाव हो रहा है, हमारे आर्थिक जीवन में बदलाव हो रहा है, वो बदलाव जाके हमारे कल्चरल लाइफ में नजर आ रहा है. वो पोस्ट मॉडर्निज्म है. तो पोस्ट मॉडर्निज्म इज नॉट, एज आई सेड, टेकिंग प्लेस और हैपनिंग ऑन इट्स ओन. देन ही ऑल्सो प्रोवाइड्स अ डेट व्हेन, और क्योंकि ये चेंजेस कब हुई, says the 1960s can be taken as the date. Let me read it. The 1960s are in many ways the key transitional period, a period in which new international order, neo-colonialism, green revolution, computerization and electronic information is at one and the same time set in place and swept and shaken by contradictions. So if we talk in terms of time, we can say that the beginning of neo-colonialism is more or less synonymous with the establishment of the USA as the superpower. So the rise of the USA and America as the cultural and political superpower and economic superpower, the beginning of the green revolution and the beginning of the age of information technology, और इसके साथ एक और ऐड कर दो, ग्लोबलाइजेशन. सो दीज आर द सोशल चेंजेस. rise of America as the superpower, one, the beginning of green revolution, the uh, beginning of the age of information technology and globalization. These all these changes begin either before 1960s or after. They catch pace after the 1960s. So these are the social factors and the and economic factors which are responsible for the rise of postmodernism or postmodern culture. So we have talked about four things now. One, that it is an incompletely understood phenomena. One, then he names a few postmodern artists. Two, he explains postmodernism as a reaction against high modernism of Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, Marcel Proust, James Joyce, etc., William Faulkner, etc., etc. फिर he talks about two developments which will take place as part of postmodern culture. Effacement of the high and the low culture, effacement of the distinction between high culture and low culture. Secondly, the emergence of theory. तीसरा जो मैंने अभी बात कही है, he says it is not a phenomena which is complete in itself, self-contained, autonomous. Okay, it is a result or outcome of a few changes which have taken place at the global level. One, globalization of the world, emergence of USA as the superpower, neo-colonialism, which is the same thing, and then the Green Revolution, beginning of Green Revolution, and the emergence of information technology as one of the organizing and governing principles of our life. Now we come to the next part, which is very important. I will read and then talk about it. One of the most significant features or practices in postmodernism today is pastiche. The next rather next section, which is rather long, relatively longer than the earlier sections, deals with this term called pastiche. One of the most significant features or practices in postmodernism today is pastiche. What is pastiche? And he says basically there are two tendencies which are common to all. वो कहते हैं सारा कुछ जो postmodernism के नीचे हो रहा है, it can be explained in terms of two things. One is pastiche, second is schizophrenia. Today मैं 10 मिनट में I will try to explain this term pastiche, and tomorrow we will go on to the second term, that is schizophrenia. Now, what is pastiche? I will be referring to the text also, but I will try to explain pastiche, okay, in itself as a phenomena, and borrowing from Jameson, and because if we read too much from the text, then maybe the momentum will get broken. So pastiche, first of all, he compares pastiche and parody and says that we should not be confusing the two. Often parody and pastiche are used as substitutes for one another, which is wrong. And he says it is very important to distinguish between pastiche and parody. Because if one was the defining characteristic of modernism, which is parody, the second is the defining characteristic of postmodernism, which is pastiche. If we can see modernism as in terms of parody, and we can see postmodernism in terms of pastiche. So I must explain this term, which people generally tend to confuse. So there is a lot of confusion in the minds of people when they talk about pastiche and parody. They often confuse the two. Okay, so both pastiche and parody involve imitation or mimicry. Both pastiche and parody are basically imitation, forms of imitation or forms of mimicry. Okay, forms of mimicry. Both are imitations, both are forms of mimicry. Then how are they different? Now, it is obvious that modern literature in general offers a very rich field for parody since the great modern writers have all. Now, इसके पीछे दो major assumptions हैं. Let me talk about them straight away. One, pastiche becomes the norm when the possibility of creating anything new ceases. ये थोड़ा इसको ध्यान से समझ लो. Pastiche कब norm बनती है? We will talk about pastiche and parody, the way he differentiates between them. लेकिन at the outset, I must talk about two things. One, when does pastiche become? He says pastiche is something that we can use to understand postmodernism. Pastiche, we can see postmodernism in terms of pastiche. Okay, we can see postmodernism in terms of pastiche. But why? Because pastiche becomes the norm. Pastiche कब norm बनती है? When the possibility of creating new things comes to an end. And postmodernism, in some senses, is a time when the possibility of creating new things comes to an end. The meanings of originality and creativity change. We have to. Now, it is a period when originality becomes questionable. It is subjected to doubt. And as I said, the possibility of creating new things ceases, it comes to an end. That is why pastiche, because pastiche is first and foremost a copy, imitation. Parody is also imitation, but how are pastiche and parody different? They are different at three levels, and all of them are very important. You can read it from this part. It is very clearly defined here. There are three levels at which parody and pastiche can be differentiated. One, parody में तीन चीजें हैं जो pastiche में नहीं है. Parody has a satiric impulse. It aims to satirize. वो व्यंग करना चाहती है. It aims to satirize. उसका पर्पस क्या है? व्यंग करना. Two, देखो मैं फिर रिपीट कर रहा हूं. There are three things in pastiche which are absent in parody. What are they? One, the satiric impulse. Pastiche में एक impulse है to व्यंग करना, to make you laugh. Pastiche has a secret sympathy with the original. Parody has a secret sympathy with the original. वो किस चीज की भी कॉपी है, इमिटेशन है, उसके साथ सिंपथी रखती है. It values the original and it focuses on, the entire focus of parody is on the deviation from the norm. कि जो norm है, जैसे हम अगर जोसेफ कॉनरेड की बात करें तो जोसेफ कॉनरेड का हार्ट ऑफ डार्कनेस आपने पढ़ा होगा. जोसेफ कॉनरेड makes use of adjectives excessively. वो हर एक चीज को डिफाइन करने के लिए दो तीन adjectives. तो अगर इसका व्यंग किया जा सकता है क्योंकि वो कॉनरेड का यूनिक स्टाइल है. तो three things which are there in parody and which are absent in pastiche. Both pastiche and parody are imitations, copy. पैरडी में सैटिरिक इम्पल्स है, इट वॉन्ट्स टू सैटराइज, इंडल्ज इन सैटायर on something. There is a secret sympathy with the original. And thirdly, it is basically it focuses on the deviation. जैसे मैंने जोसेफ कॉनरेड का एग्जांपल दिया कि he deviates from the norm. बहुत ज़्यादा एडजेक्टिव यूज करते हैं, तो आप उसको व्यंग कर सकते हो. Now all these three things are missing in pastiche. It does not have a secret satiric impulse. The aim is not to satirize, to indulge in satire. The aim is not to exhibit any secret sympathy with the original. And third is, okay, it does not bother about the deviations from the norm. तो पैस्टिश क्या गया, किस तरह की कॉपी है पैस्टिश? क्योंकि हमें पैस्टिश समझना इसलिए इंपॉर्टेंट है, पोस्ट मॉडर्निज्म इज पैस्टिश. पोस्ट मॉडर्निज्म इज पैस्टिश. जब मैंने शुरू में क्या कहा कि पैस्टिश वो कॉपी है जहाँ नया बनाने की, और वो आर्ट है, वो कॉपी है, वो इमिटेशन है जिसमें ये एक एडमिशन है कि अब नया बनाना संभव नहीं, तो हम पिछले की कॉपी करो, कॉपीज बनाओ. और इस कॉपी में पैरोडी की तरह तीन चीज़ें मिसिंग हैं जो पैरोडी को वो करती हैं, पैरोडी को उसका मीनिंग देती है. तो वो तीन चीज़ें मैंने बता दी. तो फिर पीछे रह क्या गया? पीछे क्या रह गया? द डिज़ायर टू कॉपी ओनली. ओनली द डिज़ायर टू कॉपी. नो सैटिरिक इम्पल्स, नथिंग. मिमिक्री फॉर द सेक ऑफ मिमिक्री. दिस इज व्हाट पैस्टिश इज. Mimicry for the sake of mimicry. So let me read one or two lines from here where he tries to define pastiche. Pastiche is like parody, the imitation of a peculiar or unique style, the wearing of a stylistic mask, speech in dead language. But it is a neutral practice of such men, without parody's ulterior motive, without satiric impulse, without laughter, without that still latent feeling that there exists something normal compared to which. तो चार चीज़ें नहीं है. सैटिरिक इम्पल्स नहीं है, आपको हंसाना भी नहीं, किसी चीज़ विदाउट लाफ्टर, विदाउट स्टिल लेटेंट फीलिंग दैट देयर एग्जिस्ट समथिंग नॉर्मल, ये भी नहीं है कि आपने इस चीज़ को वो दिखाना है कि देखो ये ओरिजिनल से, नॉर्म से कितना अलग है. देन व्हाट इज पैस्टिश? पैस्टिश इज अ ब्लैंक पैरोडी. पैस्टिश दैट हैज लॉस्ट इट्स सेंस ऑफ ह्यूमर. पैस्टिश इज टू पैरोडी what that curious thing, the modern practice of a kind of blank irony is to what Wayne Booth calls the stable and comic ironies and so on. So basically जो आर्ट पोस्ट मॉडर्निज्म पैराडाइम में प्रोड्यूस हो रही है, इट कैन बी डिफाइंड एज पैस्टिश. एंड व्हाट इज पैस्टिश? पैस्टिश इज जस्ट लाइक पैरोडी, कॉपी. It is an admission that new things cannot be produced, so we have to produce copies, more copies, more copies. But these copies lack all the defining properties of parody. And why does all this happen? ये मैं 2 मिनट में बता के and then I'll finish. Why does all this happen? Why does the possibility of creating new things cease, come to an end? This takes us to the next part of this essay. Why does this happen? Why this, massification of culture? Why this, why does the distinction between high art and low art come to an end? Why does an open-ended subject like theory, and why does pastiche replace parody? So this he explains as the I am reading. This new component is what is generally called the death of the subject, or to say it in more conventional language, the end of the individual as such. So, death of the subject and end of the individual. Okay. So, death of the subject and end of the individual. What does it mean? The subject doesn't die. We don't die. Nothing of this type happens. But you must remember that Roland Barthes talked about death of the author. Roland Barthes didn't mean that the author has died. He simply meant that the idea of the author, the notion of the author, has now come under interrogation. Similarly, when he says that the death of the subject has taken place, or we have witnessed the end of the individual, he means that under the altered circumstances of the 20th and 21st century, the way we look at ourselves has changed. This is what we mean by death of the subject or end of individualism. That sense of personal self. अब देखो, we come to the idea of uniqueness, creativity. You link all this with uniqueness, creativity, originality. कि जब हमारा जो अपना sense of self है, उसमें change आती है. When we stop looking at ourselves as unique human beings, when the idea of personal self comes to an end, as a result of under the new pressures which are exerting themselves on us, under the new system of social life and economic order, under the new developments that are taking place around us, the idea of individual self, personal self, unique self has come under assault. तो वो जो पर्सनल सेल्फ का आइडिया था, वो भी हमने नहीं क्रिएट किया था. इट वॉज गिवन टू अस बाय द सोसाइटी, बाय द वेरियस डिस्कोर्सेस विच वर ऑपरेटिंग इन द सोसाइटी ड्यूरिंग द लास्ट सेंचुरीज. मैंने नहीं क्रिएट किया कि मेरी पर्सनल सेल्फ है और मुझे जिंदगी को देखने का मेरा पर्सनल नजरिया है. ये अंडरस्टैंडिंग भी समाज ने दी थी. अभी वो जो अंडरस्टैंडिंग ऑफ दैट वे ऑफ लुकिंग एट आवर सेल्फ, दैट आइडिया ऑफ पर्सनल सेल्फ, that idea of individual has come under question, has become subject to doubt, because so many things have taken place. चाहे आप उसको कह लो the expansion of technology है, चाहे आज के टाइम में artificial intelligence है, चाहे globalization है. मतलब the individual has got fragmented. We have multiple selves, and even they are not completely comprehensible to us. So this has led to the disintegration of the self, the personal self. This is what Jameson talks about. The disintegration of the self leads to all the changes जो हम शुरू से लेके अभी तक बात करते आ रहे हैं. To pastiche. जब आपको अपनी यूनिकनेस में ही फेथ नहीं, तो आप यूनिक वर्क्स कैसे प्रोड्यूस करोगे? When your own self is disintegrated, then the only possibility is creating pastiche, mimicry. So, उसके बाद he gives some examples of pastiche, particularly nostalgia film.